was, so wie das eben auch in Englisch stattfindet, weil wir zwei internationale Gäste haben. Es gibt dann auch die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen, gerne auch auf Deutsch oder Finnisch, je nachdem, wie Sie mögen, aber das Gespräch ist auf English, so we will just switch to English because that's our common ground, but if there are any questions afterwards, I said we can answer them in Finnish or in German or whatever. Yeah, it's a big pleasure and a big honor to introduce to you two very important players of the Finnish comic scene who in different roles are very important, not for Finnish comics alone, but also I would say for European comics, because there's a lot that we in Germany or in the European comic scene can benefit from reading Finnish comics. So I introduce to you, right next to me, Kalle Hakkola, who is active in the comics in very many roles. I think you're the director of the Helsinki Comics Center, and you're also a curator of a lot of exhibitions, including the one that can be seen here. And you're also in touch with a lot of artists, and one of the artists that I have the pleasure to introduce to you today is Mika Lidsen. So before we start talking about Finnish comics, I would like to ask you just off the top, if you have an answer, like in order to prepare this talk, I had another look at how many people live in Finland. I think it's about like 5 million or something. And then I looked at other countries of that size. And all the other countries I found, I could not remember a single comics person from those countries, like Ireland, I think is about the same size, Denmark, and then a lot of countries in sort of Eastern Europe. And I could not remember a lot of comic artists from these relatively small countries, but from Finland there are dozens of comic artists that we, if we are interested in comics in Germany, might be able to know, like partly artists who can be seen in the comics anthology, Comics Atlas, but also in other publications that are out here in Germany. Do you have any explanation, like what's the main reason why does Finland A have such a sort of vital comics scene, and B, how come a lot of it is also available to us compared to Denmark or Ireland, for example?
Well, one thing probably is that the Finnish language is pretty separate. We don't have anything really close, so we have worked internationally from the day one. If you want to live with the comics, you have to aim somewhere outside of Finland. And we have the Moomin exhibition here, so that would be my, if you want really simple answer, Tove Jansson has been really showing and leading the way how to go to the world and make the works available to the world.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's, if you're a small country, if you live in a small country, you're probably going to have to leave it someday to achieve any kind of level of competitiveness in art. I think the same applies in many arts. Like, I mean, you know, always like Norwegian artists like Edvard Munch and Henrik Ibsen, who both went to Europe to do most of their art. So,
yeah,
I guess.
Well, I still, that could be said also for Denmark, for example. But I guess when we have a closer look at your work and at work of other Finnish comic artists, maybe we'll get a better feeling for what's special about Finnish comics. And as I said, one of the publications that I find very important in this context only came out a few months ago, the Comic Atlas Finnland. It's a sort of collection of shorter stories or short excerpts from longer stories from Finnish artists, and it's edited by Sasha Homma, who's quite well known to German comic readers. But Kalle, you also played a role in putting earlier editions of comparable comic anthologies together. But in this one, I think it was mostly Sasha's job to go to Finland, look at artists, and sort of put them together, right?
Yeah, well, it's really hard to say where the Sasha's job started and where mine ended. Of course, I played a big role. We have so many artists at the end in Finland, so it would have been too much for Sasha to try to explore everything and then put it in there. But I've been involved with this is an anthology series that we have published annually. First two editions were published in English, and the 2013 was published in French, and now this year it was published in German. So the book has a history throughout those other language versions, and I've been behind each and every project so far, and of course as well with this one. We are really good friends with Sasha as well, so it was really easy to work and really natural, so I don't even want to think what our role was. Sasha's name is in the book as an editor, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and as I said, it's a great collection of short stories, but also of, oh now this got stuck here, just a moment. Alright, so yeah, short stories and excerpts from longer stories. And Mika, your story in there, by the way, Litzen, do I say Litzen? Because it has that French accent there? So it's Litzen, huh?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. Your story, from my understanding, is one of the stories in the book that is a complete story, or at least it can be read as a complete story. It's a very touching story of about people lost in the middle of society. We have this supermarket scenario, and there's this woman who's apparently lost, but there's obviously a bigger story behind it. It's a very touching human interest story. Did you create this for this anthology because it fits so nicely and it's a completed story, unlike most of the others?
No, actually, I just did it because I wanted to do something. I just got the idea for the story, and I went ahead and did it without any knowledge of where it was going to be published eventually. I did collect it for a small publication that I did in 2012 called Kaksi pientä novellia, or Two Stories, which this was one of the stories, and then there was a 5-page short story. I really like short stories, and it's quite natural for me to do that type of, 10 or 5 or 20 pages. And even my new story is like 32 pages only, so it's I enjoy it. It's a little shorter distance from the idea to the execution, so to speak. So album-length stories, they demand a little more patience.
Yeah. We'll have a look at your more recent story as well a little later on. But I'm just wondering, your stories in particular, and to me that also seems true for a number of other Finnish stories, they have a deepness. They're very strong in terms of the character. There's, in your story particularly, there's this very strong sadness in there. It's sort of a melancholy story, if you want, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's beautifully executed. And it's a story that, almost to me, reads a bit like a theater play. We have this stage, in this case like a supermarket, and we have these characters entering and leaving. And I in order to prepare this talk, I read a few of your other stories, and I found one that was published in France, Elegie, I think it was called, which is a completely empty stage, and you just see one person on the stage and another person on the stage. It's a bit like a Samuel Beckett play or something. Yeah. So my association when I look at your comics, it's theater play and focus very much on the writing behind it. Is sort of that where your background is?
My background is in literature studies. I studied English at the university, and I guess I'm always more interested in the story rather than maybe the visual side. I have absolutely no education in visual arts or anything like that, so I just learned it along the way. But I've always been sort of attracted to the storytelling side of comics. Definitely the sort of dramatic structures, narrative structures, different time levels, that sort of things. And at one point, I was really influenced. I mentioned Henrik Ibsen before because Ibsen's plays have been quite influential in my own work. My first album in 2007 was pretty much inspired by Ibsen's plays. You know, the sort of that there's a social consciousness behind the stories, but they're also dramatically built character pieces, so that there's like two sides to the stories. It's not only about the characters, but it's also about the society at large.
Yeah.
And this story is definitely part of that continuity.
Yeah. We'll have another look at some more of your stories later. But when we prepared for this talk, I asked you, which other Finnish comics are important to you? I mean, we will talk about the Finnish comics anthology, but beyond that, I asked you, and that was the first comic book you mentioned, and as far as I know, that's something we don't have in German. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about why is this an important comic when we talk about Finnish comics?
Paul Kallio, in general, Paul Kallio is the writer of this series. He's generally a very important person in Finnish comics. He's pretty much the father of independent publishing, for one. I mean, regardless of what kind of comics independent publishers put out these days, they're almost certainly being influenced by Pauli Kallio's example with Suuri Purkitsa, which started in 1980s, something. I don't remember the exact year, but yeah, definitely. And this Krampeen Yrjätyksiä, which translates as Cramps and Strains, was appeared in the Sunday papers in the 90s, and it was drawn by Krista Muutinen. And it's a sort of everyday events in the lives of most ordinary people. And I think that was the first comic strips that I read in the 90s, that I actually realized that you can actually do stories about sort of events events that actually seem important to you as a person, and about people who are like you, and everything like that. So it was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah. Another book you mentioned is a book that actually was introduced to me half a year ago when I was in Helsinki. I had the chance to visit Helsinki and meet Kalle there at the Finnish, the Helsinki Comic Center, and you just had an exhibition by Ape Ronen. No, sorry.
J.P. Ahonen.
J.P. Ahonen, yeah. Oh God, my Finnish got a little rusty. J.P. Ahonen. And I think this book will come out in German very soon at Panini's, right?
Yes, hopefully before Frankfurt Book Fair.
So this fall it should come out.
Yeah.
And what I took from the exhibition in Helsinki is that it's obviously about a band, a heavy metal band. I think Finland, I saw a map at some point where they had like a list of how many heavy metal bands per capita you have in the world, and Finland had like 100 times as many as the rest of the world, basically. So this, I think, is a story that's about a rock band or metal band or something, and it's an important piece of comics for Finnish comics, like I say.
Yeah, definitely. The connection to Pauli Kallio is, of course, that J.P. Ahonen is also obviously influenced by Pauli Kallio. His series Ville Piposa, or I don't know how it's translated, Golden Exposure maybe, is pretty similar. It's clearly influenced by Cramps and Strains, and his early storytelling fashion was quite similar to what Pauli Kallio did with Cramps and Strains. Berger is a bit different, but it still sort of sticks to a sort of Finnish landscape. It's a fantasy tale, but it's also set in the real world, like in Tampere, which is a city in Finland. And yeah, it's pretty good. And I'm especially impressed by that he can also do the sort of long narrative or long graphic novel. This is a very long, substantial piece of work, I'd say, that really holds together very well story-wise.
Yeah, and then of course one artist who also is part of the sort of Finnish comics export sort of campaign at the moment, Ville Ranta. I think there's also a short story of his in the anthology. And you mentioned that you even sort of have been partners with him, and you've exchanged a lot of ideas and collaborated a lot.
Yeah, we publish comics under the name Asema Publishing. We've been doing that for now 14 years. Maybe we met something like 15, 16 years ago in Helsinki when I was working there, and when I was a student at the university, and with other publishing companies. So yeah, we've been working ever since. And
I found that quite a surprising match, because at least when you just look at the drawing style, because his style reminds me very much of this sort of new French style, association, or like the kind of, or sort of more French experimental style, whereas yours is a lot more controlled and maybe also a little more influenced by North American comics, I would say.
Maybe. Yeah,
But you still seem to.
But it's about the narrative.
Yeah,
These
that's
two
what they
guys, yeah.
Yeah, it's always about the content for us. We have similar background. We're from literature studies and that sort of thing. We've not been in art school or anything, so we have that in common. And I think we usually when we comment on each other's work, we usually comment on the story aspects and that sort of things. We don't really get into details about what we're actually drawing. So, but we can read each other's works very well. So that is kind of interesting.
Is that, Kalle, would you say that's sort of typical for the Finnish comic scene, that the story first? Because I mean, there's a lot of Finnish comics that I can't read because they're in Finnish, but my impression was that there's also a lot of magazines where it's all about the art and story not so important. But here it's the other way around. Huh?
Yeah, here is the other way around, and with Suurkurpitsa is maybe most often another way around, but of course most of the contemporary Finnish comics is more known about the artistic perspective and with, for example, Kuti Kuti, Tomi Musturi and those guys, they quite often go first with the artistic idea and then execute maybe a narrative into it, or maybe sometimes not.
Yeah, we will have some examples of Kuti Kuti later, which is a really great magazine. Oh yeah, this is one of the short stories that Ville Ranta created for the anthology, which we will have a look at in a minute. And then there's one other book that I was very happy that you mentioned as important, because by coincidence I discovered this at the Helsinki Comics Center. It's a very moving story, which at least I read as a story about a lost child, by a woman who lost her child and then it appears as a ghost, by Terhi Ekeboom. And that's a book you mentioned also as a very important example of Finnish comics.
Yeah, I actually helped publish it. So.
Oh, okay. You're a publisher too?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Asana Publishing is the name under which we operate with Ville. And I love that book. It's a great book. I wish we had printed more because it's now sold out. Sorry.
Oh, so you didn't bring any here to Erlangen?
No, it's
all
because
I was hoping I could get another copy.
It was a really dramatic thing that Terhi got this annual award that we give a lifetime award achievement every January, called Puupähattu, to one comic artist, and Terhi got it this year, and the book was actually sold out just before, so she didn't have anything to sell one.
So is it going to be different, or foreign edition maybe?
I don't know.
Foreign edition maybe.
Okay. Well, this book, as I mentioned, is a book that I mentioned in this fantastic place. That, as you can see, I took this picture about half a year ago. That's how it looked in Helsinki half a year ago.
Well, it snowed this week in Helsinki.
It snowed this week in Helsinki? Yes. Oh God, that's crazier than all the stereotypes about having fairness. Really? Yeah. Oh man, so this is how it looks in Helsinki right now. And you can see
there is light. There is light 24 hours a day.
Oh yeah, that's true. When I was there, they didn't have light. And it's a fantastic place. It's a I think, partly publicly funded place, and I would like to learn a little about comics funding, because we in Germany, we have also a big debate going on how much funding, how much support do comics need. And my impression is that in Finland, there's a lot more of that. And this place especially is a place where you can read, where you can do classes, exhibitions, where you can just meet comics people. It's just across the street from the art school or art university. And I got it right that it's sort of funded by the federal government or by the city, or how does that?
By the state.
By the state.
Yeah. The state or the Ministry of Culture.
Yeah.
We get about 25% of our budget from there, but 75% comes from other sources.
Yeah. You teach and you offer classes.
We teach and offer classes, and we do a lot of projects that we get funded from other sources like EU or private organizations.
Because my impression was that the reason that we have so many cool comics coming from Finland partly is because there's a lot of impressive authors and artists that create these comics, but also because there's a very supportive network where you get funding, teaching, and so on. Did you ever, was that ever important for you? To what extent other comics that you only made because you got some funding or some kind of support network?
Pretty much all of them. I mean, I work as a comic artist full time, basically, so I'm totally dependent on grant money. I also do some illustrations, but mostly I want to do comics.
So you just go from one grant to the next, or how does that work?
Well, pretty much.
It sounds like paradise for you. I mean, that's...
Yeah, but it's also a lot of work just to apply. You know, you have to apply all the time, basically.
Yeah.
So, but there's, it could be a little bit more. I mean, you know, the annual grant money for artists is very low compared to other arts. Like architecture, they receive a great number of grants, a big amount of money, but for Finnish comic artists, it's all like something like total 7 years of grant money each year or something like that. It's very low compared to others.
Well, the nice thing is, at least my impression is that there's not only grants to support the artists, but there's also grant money for translations. Fili, I think, is sort of the Finnish literature service that translates and that supports a lot of, I think, the short stories and excerpts that we find in here were also generously supported by Fili. So this book probably is a book that we only have partly because of that kind of funding exists in Finland, right?
Sure, yeah. I think when it comes to Finnish support system, one thing that Finland still supports quite well is the international work and the cultural exchange programs, what this is all about. So Fili is Finnish Literature Exchange, the name, and so that tells a lot what it's about. And I think in that way we are really in a good situation with most of the other funding ways. We still have a lot to do and a lot to make it better, but the international grants in Finland are quite good.
Yeah. And it's quite a varied selection of art and stories you find in there. This one is by Markku Turunen. Some Germans might know his work. I think one book or two I published at Mami Publishing House, which is a very small publishing house, but still you could read some of his stuff in German. But I think he's quite an important player in the Finnish comic scene, was my impression at least. He seems very present there.
Well, he is, as many artists, and he is very different from all the others. He has a really tight structure always, especially when he makes exhibitions, he has a little architectural background. He has studied architecture, so those structures that he does and the way he also makes the story go on and plans the pages, they have these kind of house-like structures.
Yeah. This is quite a bizarre story, and there's a lot of beautiful stories in there. This one is by Reita Niemsivu.
Yeah, Reita is actually present here. She's a part of the exhibition here.
There she is again.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Sorry, I'm still working on pronouncing the name properly.
She's a part of the exhibition here, and she is published by Public by Suuri Kurpitsa, and she is definitely, even though the pages are really beautiful and drawing is really beautiful, it's all about the narrative and the story.
Yeah, and this is a great story which I highly recommend. If anybody reads this excerpt of the story, you should buy her whole book, because it's only a short element of the whole book, and the whole book is out in Finnish, and as was mentioned before, has English subtitles. So
and it came out now in French as well.
Okay.
We don't have it with us here.
Okay, because it's really worth reading the whole story as is with most of the other stories that only have excerpts in there. Tomi Musturi was mentioned. I mean, he's someone that we know from Unterwegs with Samuel, which is a wordless, but still very, very strong and narrative story, and surprisingly quite a different style here in this case. So he seems to apply very different styles according to different stories, right? Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. Tommy works in he used to work in advertisement business and with graphic design. So in there he learned to work in so many different styles and ways. And he came quite late to the comics actually, and started then to work in a really many ways. And nowadays he works also as a fine artist sometimes and does paintings and things like that. So he's really experimental.
Yeah. And there's a lot of artists in there. We could probably talk about each and every one of them for an hour respectively. But one thing I find interesting when I look at the whole group, Anna Sainama, for example, and a lot of other female artists are here. And if we would put together an anthology of German comics, nowadays we might have more female artists than maybe 5 years ago. But my impression is that in Finland, when I look at the older examples of your anthology, there's always been a very strong presence of female artists, and much stronger than in most other countries. Why is that?
Well, I don't know, equality. I don't know, it's just always been like that. I've never actually thought about it that much because it's so natural for Finnish comics that there is such a strong presence of female artists. And
maybe we should ask the question the other way around. Why is it that in other countries it's not like that?
But at the end, again, the answer is the same as for the first question you had, Uwe Jansson. We have a really good example behind us, and also in other art forms we have strong female artists as a writers, as a well, in all art forms. So it has been really natural for Finnish scene also to have a female artist, and also the fact that Finland is such a small country and the mainstream comics are not a big thing, so it's more about the art and self-expression and things like that. So maybe it's easier than, or the whole comics community and everything that is around it is more achievable by the women as well. Last year we did the French version of the anthology series, and that included only female artists, because we decided that even though French is the biggest market in Europe, the percentage of female artists is still really ridiculous there, and it was a bit of like trying to have some kind of discussion about it in there as well.
Yeah. One of the other things that this is another topic, but one of the other things that I find interesting is that most of the stories that I encountered so far, they are set in a more or less rural setting or small town setting, whereas when I went to Helsinki, my impression was that most of the artists live in Helsinki or at least in cities, but the comics still are set often in the countryside. That seems to be a very important sort of setting and maybe also inspiration for Finnish comics creators. I mean, is that just a stereotype that I have as someone looking at Finland as this huge sort of forest, or is that really an important sort of inspiration?
I think the countryside is present in a lot of Finnish art in general, but I think my generation, people who were born in the 70s, their parents moved to small towns outside the big cities, which are sort of rural places. And I think that sort of feeds at least some of the comics that they actually do come from these small places, and they have moved since to big cities, but once the countryside always stays with you, even wherever you go. So yeah, that's part of it.
Another example is Hanna-Riina Moissinen, who also has a small excerpt of a longer story in this anthology. And once again, if you like the little bit that you can read of her stuff, I would highly recommend to buy this book, because there's so much more to discover. And once again, this is also out in Finnish with English subtitles. That seems to be the way to go these days. Are all Finnish comics sort of with English subtitles, or is it only?
Well, not all, but nearly all the small publishers do it, because, well, first of all, the artists themselves, they want to get their stuff out there, not only in Finland, but also be readable for you, for anybody here in the audience. So that is the way to do it. Some even print their stuff straight to English, but it's still like small percentage of the books that are sold internationally, but it's still, I think it's more I don't know, Mika has maybe better knowledge because he's a publisher, but I think it's more for the artist. It's that the artist can use those books as a reference to abroad if they have the subtitles, and for the sales it's not a big thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's a sort of, the book becomes a calling card for the artist so that they can show it to publishers and publishers can read it basically.
I see, okay, yeah. One of the short stories in the anthology is by Erlangen, which is a very funny story about this sort of lynx character, animal character, acting kind of strangely human. And he's not only a Erlangen comics creator, but when I met him in Helsinki in the winter, at least at that time, he also was the acting sort of editor of Kuti Kuti magazine. I think it's a sort of rotating job, but you mentioned Kuti Kuti earlier, and that's another example of something where public money really, I think, does a good job, because this is a magazine, if I understood correctly, that is funded by the Ministry for Education or something, and is part of their language sort of communications program or whatever, but in fact it's just a crazy independent underground comics magazine with a lot of wild stuff in there, but it's still funded by the government, right?
It is funded by the government. In Finland we do have a quite good support system for magazines that have articles. So in each Kuti Kuti magazine there is an article as well. It's not only about that, but there has to be always that article that gives in the money. It's an international magazine as well. It's a artist studio that started out about 10 years ago, and they started with the crazy idea of having a tabloid magazine published 4 times a year, given freely out all around in Finland, and they were so confident that they can make it with the private money just by selling ads, and at first they actually made it for the 10 first editions, and then nobody believed that it could last much longer, but then they started to get the support, and nowadays it is fairly well known also internationally, because they do, even though they are really not that well structured and all the other things might seem chaotic, but those deadlines always keep, and they get the paper out. I don't know how they do it, but
and they look beautiful.
Yeah,
beautiful. It's beautiful art there. I mean, these are all the covers. It looks a little more chaotic than it actually is. These are just 8 covers of 8 different.
And they always have themes. Like latest issue has a theme of newspaper strips. We have some copies at our exhibitions. Not too many. They would probably last only for until tomorrow.
That's the museum called again?
Kunstverein gallery. Yeah. But in the autumn, they will then do a joint split edition of Kuti in German and Finnish. They have done the same split editions in US together with the US publisher Smoke Signal, and in Sweden and Denmark as well. But now this year they are doing the German edition in the autumn.
So you should hurry up to get to the Kunstverein and pick up an example of this. When we talk about Finnish comics, I mean, the Finnish comic that this year, at least in Germany, received the most public attention, the most press, the most reviews and interviews and so on, probably is Ville Tjärtäväinen's book, which is called Unsichtbare Hände, Invisible Hands. It's this fantastic project that's based on 5-year research I think he did together with an anthropologist about refugees from North Africa and their horrible fate in Spain, and how the dream of living in Europe, it turns into a nightmare. And this is quite an outstanding book from the subject matter, from the fact that he worked 5 years on it or more. To what extent is this like a standalone book for Finnish comics, or does it also, in one way or the other, is it maybe also typical for something in the Finnish comics in terms of size and amount of effort? And
well, I don't know. I mean, Perkeros is a substantial book, as I mentioned earlier. So I think this sort of big book projects, they are becoming more and more common in Finnish comics. I mean, again, in 5 years, it was made possible by a working grant from the government. So that's We're very thankful for all that money that they give us.
That's great.
Sometimes this kind of books are made because of that.
Even though when I met him in Helsinki in January, he was just doing commission work for, what is it called? Kalle Anka? No,
Donald Duck. Aku Ankka.
Aku Anka, exactly. The Donald Duck in Finnish. He was drawing Donald Duck strips, so it looks like the grant was used up at that point.
Yeah, he is a professional illustrator at first, and then comic artist at second, and that's why, and he has family, and that's why the 5 year, this is really also for us really good example when saying what can you achieve with those grants.
Yeah.
This book, this would not, it's not a joke, it would not exist without that grant.
And it triggered a big debate also in Finland. I know it was really covered widely in the newspapers, and he's always interviewed. And so
Well, fairly okay. Yeah. He was also lucky that the Finnish movie director Aki Kaurismäki did the latest film Le Havre with a little bit same topic at the same time. So they gained from each other, and there was a lot of discussions about that issue.
yeah. And then there's a lot of other interesting projects. This one is a traveling exhibition of short stories. I don't think it's showing here in Erlangen. It was showing at the Fumeta Festival in Luzern, which once again brings together a lot of artists that took part in a workshop. I think in your comic center, right? Isn't that something that came from a workshop that was offered there by a journalist and comics experts? So you have these workshops and you bring in people there, and then you also help them to publish their first work. Is this sort of an outcome that the Finnish comics, the Helsinki Comics Center would also then sort of support on a regular basis, or is this just a one-time project?
Well, this project is mainly not from us. We are just one partner in it. It is done by two journalists, Ville Hänninen and Harri Römpötti, and we offered plays and some help with arranging stuff. The idea here was to bring in together 8 young talented artists who really need to get focused more on the narrative side, and the idea is to with these stories is to really bring up the narratives from the usually maybe more visual things, especially like Jari Vaara there with him. It was, I think it worked really well. And yes, we do these kind of projects all the time, and of course it's really important for the Comic Center and for the Finnish comic scene to keep on helping people to publish their stuff and to do their stuff, because it is.
And it's great, and once again, if you're interested in reading Finnish comics, this is out also with English subtitles, so all of these stories also can be read if you're comfortable reading English. And another book which also has English subtitles is sort of a premiere. I think it's not even out in print yet, right? Or is it? That's your new book?
Yes.
You just finished it. I only have the PDF here, 1986, and it's a beautiful, but also very disturbing story. Oh, great. Wow, thank you. Looks even... Wow, it looks very flashy with the reflection. Yeah, it looks very 1986. Cool. It's a story that sort of partly is just a sort of a coming of age story. It talks about teenagers in high school and the weird stuff that they sometimes do, but it also seems to blend elements of horror, very subtle horror story, slightly disturbing. But to me, I read it as a very autobiographical story. My guess would be that the character is roughly your age, sort of.
Roughly.
So what's the story behind the story here?
Well, actually, I wanted to do a story of, in 1986, Stephen King released It, which is a major book for me, at least in my childhood, and I think I wanted to do a tribute to that sort of growing up stories or coming of age stories. This is a sort of continuation of sort of semi-autobiographical comics that I've done a couple of times earlier, but the character is completely fictional, and the story is completely fictional, but the setting is, and obviously his taste in music is very similar to mine. So
you still have your old Iron Maiden records at home?
Yes.
Cool. It's a really great story and very touching and disturbing and really nicely told. So this is sort of available here now, or?
Yes, at the Comic-Salon gallery at the exhibition.
At the gallery, it comes fine. It can be bought there.
Yes.
Okay.
Only €8.
Only €8.
Very cheap.
And it's quite interesting to see this story and then compare it to the story you have in the anthology, and then also to compare it to the story Elegy, which I mentioned earlier, which is this sort of, I don't know, existentialist or absurd sort of theater play. My impression was that either over the course of the years you just develop from one style to another, or do you always sort of think what kind of story you want to tell, and then afterwards you try to find the style that matches it in a way?
I think the ideas and the style come almost parallel to each other. I think at the time of Elegy and my first album, I was very impressed by theater plays and that sort of aesthetic, very minimalist stuff. But I've also since then I've read, I started reading American comics and that sort of things more and more, which I've neglected for years. And this 1986 comic pretty much came from me reading, old Neil Adams, Batman, and that sort of comics, which I've never actually read before. So,
Yeah, great classics. We have a few minutes left to introduce some questions from the audience. If you have any questions or remarks or whatever you want to say, now would be a good opportunity. You just raise it. Yes. Oh, you're just setting the camera. Okay. Well, there will be another opportunity because I have one more topic that I briefly would like to talk about because Finnish comics, as we know them here in Germany now, we know the anthology, we know some larger books, but what I found interesting to learn was when I was in Helsinki that the main part of comics actually in terms of the economic side and the publication side and so on, the main part of comics still seems to be happening in the newspapers. At least that's sort of the largest playing field. And here we see a newspaper on the left that has a few comics from other countries, but then also some Finnish work, and on the right-hand side we see some collections of Finnish newspaper comic artists that then later get published as collections. So I'm wondering, are these two different scenes, or like Mika, would you also do newspaper comics sometimes? Do they overlap and mix?
I've done some newspaper comics previously, and all of the artists know each other, so it's not completely different scenes. It's a little bit of different media, I'd say, but and there are different traditions, of course, in newspaper scenes, but I think there's a lot of overlap in the end. As I mentioned, the Crimson Strange strip, it's it's about everyday people, and that sort of stories are also in Comic-Salon about everyday people. It's just a different format, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, I mean, Kalle, as you mentioned before, there's sort of the godmother of Finnish comics, Tove Jansson. This July, I think she would have turned 100. This August would have been her 100th anniversary, and she's a really sort of important author, of course, of novels and other work. But in Germany, we mostly probably know her for the Moomins, which are very popular characters here too. And I noticed in Finland, when I was in Helsinki, there's whole souvenir shops dedicated to the Moomins, like Moomin World here, Moomin Shop there. Is that just for the tourists, or are they also sort of key characters still in the Finnish idea of Finnishness and also of comics in Finland? How important are they nowadays?
Well, they are. Tove Jansson was really influential both in the comics world but also in the narrative. I think as other forms of art, she is maybe not that well known either in Finland, but neither in Finland, but throughout the Moomins, everybody in Finland knows them, and to everybody's childhood these days belong the Moomin characters in so many ways throughout the mugs and curtains and pillows and whatever. Her influence is huge, but also lately, thanks to Drawn and Quarterly, that made this really nice edition for the comics they are really appreciated as proper comics as well, because it belonged in the 90s only to the children's world, and these days it's recognized much wider.
Yeah, and I think the drawn and quarterly comics then are used by Reproduct for the German edition, which is an ongoing project, I understand.
Yeah, it is really widely published series, so I'm really thankful for Drawn and Quarterly of making such a good effort on it.
Yeah. It's good. And there's a Moomins exhibition here as well.
There is a small Moomins exhibition here as well, and of course during this special year for Tuve's 100th anniversary, there's a lot of exhibitions all around. So in Helsinki we have now in the National Museum a big exhibition that focuses mostly on her or other art sites. But
yeah. Great. Well, now is the last chance if there are any questions that popped up. And I would just say thank you very much. We've used up our time and I found it very enriching. Are there any things that you still want to share regarding Finnish comics, or shall we just leave it at this? Or, great. Thank you very much for coming here, and
thank you.
Yeah, well, use the opportunity to go to the shows that we mentioned and look at the books. Thank you very much once again.
Well, one thing is that we are having finished. It's midsummer in Finland, or it's midsummer in here as well. But what comes together with Finland and Moomins and everything, midsummer is a really big part of Youth 1986 and everything else. So on Saturday here we have a midsummer party. It's in the courtyard of Stadmuseum.
Oh, okay.
So everybody is welcome there in the Stadmuseum to have a Finnish midsummer party together with Reproduct and the others. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for listening.